Hello and welcome to the lesson. And in this lesson, we'll be discussing loops in Java. During this lesson, we'll discuss the following topics. Types of loops in Java, for, while, do, while. We'll also discuss the syntax and usage of each loop type. We'll also see some examples of loops in Java code. We'll see the usage of break and continue statements. And we'll also share tips for efficient looping. In Java, a loop is a programming structure that allows you to execute a block of code repeatedly. Loops are used when you need to execute a particular set of statements multiple times, either a fixed number of times or an indefinite number of times, until a certain condition is met. Java has three types of loops: the for loop, the while loop, and the do while loop. The for loop is used when you need to execute a block of code a fixed number of times. It consists of three parts enclosed in parentheses: initialization, condition, and increment or decrement. The initialization is executed only once at the beginning of the loop. The condition is checked before each iteration, and the increment-decrement is executed at the end of each iteration. The for loop is a control flow statement that allows you to iterate through a certain number of iterations in your code. The basic syntax of a for loop is as follows, as you could see at the example. For, then in parentheses we have an initialization, then condition, and increment-decrement. The initialization section is where you set the initial value of your loop counter. The condition is where you set the condition for the loop to continue running. And the increment-decrement section is where you update the value of your loop counter. For example, let's say we want to print the numbers from 1 to 10. We would set our initialization to a variable I equal to 1, our condition to I less than or equal 10, and our increment to I++. This would result in the following code, as you can see at the demo 1. So in this case, int I equals 1 is initialization, I less than or equal to 10 is condition, and I++ is increment. After that, in brackets, there is a code that will be executed for each iteration. This code would output the numbers 1 through 10 in the console. It is important to note that the condition should be a Boolean expression and it is tested before the loop body is executed. It's important to remember that the for loop is best used when you know the number of iterations ahead of time. The for loop is a great choice when you want to perform a specific number of iterations and you want to use a counter. Let's now look at the following example. So I have already prepared a template for what we are going to do. So first of all, we are going to create a for loop that counts from 5 to 15 in increments of 2. So let's start doing it. First of all, we need to print for. After that, the initialization block comes. In order to initialize it, we will define int variable called I and we'll assign the value of 5 because we need to count from 5. After that, we need to specify the condition. I is less than or equal 15 because we are counting to 15. And after that, we need to specify the increment. Increment will be the following. We will increment I by 2 every time. And within the loop, we just need to print I. Let's run the program and see the output. Okay, so we see a for loop that counts from 5 to 15 in increments of 2. And we see that it's counting appropriately. Okay, so let's move to the next case. Here we need to define a for loop that counts down from 10 to 1. So let's do that. In the initialization block, we will now define the variable with value 10 because we are going to count down. Also, the condition will be that I is greater than or equal to 1. And the decrement will be I minus minus, because we are going to extract 1 from I during each iteration. So let's print I within the body. Let's run the program and see the output. Okay, so we can see a count from 10 to 1, and it works. So let's move to the next step. Here we need to define a for loop that prints out the first 10 even numbers. So let's do it. We initialize it with I equals 2. After that, the condition is I is less than or equal to 20, and I will be incremented by 2. And let's print I again. For all of these cases, please mention that I is just a local variable. So let's run the program and see. Okay, here we go. It's printed correctly. So let's move on to the next step. Here we need to define a for loop that calculates the factorial of a given number. So the factorial is a mathematical function that is represented by an exclamation mark, this way. It is used to find the product of all positive integers from 1 to a given number. For example, the factorial of 5, let me leave a comment here. The factorial of 5 equals 5 multiplied by 4, by 3, by 2, by 1, which equals to 120. And factorials are commonly used in probability and statistics, as well as in combinatorics and other areas of mathematics. So here we need to calculate the factorial of 5 using the for loop. So let's define the loop. And as you can see, we have already defined the number and the initial value for the factorial. So for int I equals 1, we will start from 1, and I is less than or equal to num to this variable, and increment is just I++. And for each iteration, we'll update the factorial and we'll multiply it by I. So factorial equals to factorial multiplied by I. Or in shortened version, it can be written in the following way. So let's run the program and see if it works correctly. Okay, so it prints that factorial of 5 is 120, which is the correct output. Let's discuss the syntax and usage of while loops in Java. The while loop is used when you need to execute a block of code as long as a certain condition is true. It consists of a condition enclosed in parentheses. The condition is checked at the beginning of each iteration. The basic syntax for a while loop as it follows. You can see it at the example. While condition, and then in the brackets we have a code that will be executed. The condition is evaluated before each iteration of the loop. And if it's true, the code block within the loop will be executed. Once the condition becomes false, the loop will exit and the program will continue with the next line of code after the loop. It's important to keep in mind that if the condition is never met, the loop will run indefinitely, creating an infinite loop. This can cause performance issues, so it's important to include a way to exit the loop within the code block. Here is an example of a while loop that prints the numbers from 1 to 10. You can see it in the demo too. In this example, the variable I is initialized to 1, and the while loop runs as long as I is less than or equal to 10. The code within the loop prints the current value of I and then increments it by 1. This way, the condition I less than or equal to 10 will eventually become false and the loop will exit. Another example of a while loop is a program that repeatedly prompts a user for input until they enter a valid value. So let's run the following program. Let's create the scanner input equals new scanner system in. So in this line we created a scanner. Let's now define int age variable with the value of -1. I will explain why we set -1 a little bit later. And now let's define the loop. So while age is less than 0, because age cannot be less than 0. So that's what we want to validate here. So while age is less than 0, we want to prompt user to enter the age, to re-enter it again, because age is invalid. So while age is less than 0, we'll print enter your age. And let's use just print instead of print line here. And after that, let's assign to variable age the following value: input dot next int. And here, if age is less than 0, we also need to notify user that he inputted something invalid. So let's print invalid age. Please enter a positive value. So let's run the program and see how it works. Okay, so the program prompts us to enter our age. Let's input something negative, -10. It says invalid age, please enter a positive value. So let's input -1. Let's input 0. Okay, 0 is valid age. Let's assume that it's possible when someone has just born. So if we think that 0 is not a valid age, we can update this condition to less than or equal to 0. And in this case, we'll also ignore zeros. Let's run the program again. Now let's enter 0. And as you can see now, 0 is invalid value. So let's input something valid, like 10. Okay, 10 is a valid age, so the program accepted it. So in this case, we used a while loop to check if the age is less than or equal to 0. And while this condition is true, the code within these brackets, within the following brackets, will be executed. A do-while loop is similar to a while loop, but with one key difference. The do-while loop will always execute the code within the loop at least once, and then continue to execute as long as the condition is true. This is in contrast to a while loop, which checks the condition before executing the code within the loop. The syntax for a do-while loop as it follows. You can see it at the example. Do, after that the code that will be executed, after that while goes, and the condition in parentheses. The code within the curly braces will always be executed at least once, and then the condition will be evaluated. If the condition is true, the code within the loop will continue to execute. If the condition is false, the loop will exit. Here is an example of a do-while loop that will print the numbers 1 to 10. You can see it at the demo 3. So, as you can see, the variable x is initialized to 1 before the loop. The code within the loop then prints the value of x and increments it by 1. The condition in the while statement is x is less than or equal to 10. So as long as the value of x is less than or equal to 10, the loop will continue to execute. Another example. Let's say you want to get input from the user until they enter a positive number. So let's define a scanner again. Scanner equals new scanner, and we specify system in here. Don't forget to import Java util scanner. So next, let's define num variable with number. And after that, we will use the do-while loop to prompt user to enter a positive number. So within the loop, let's print the following. Enter a positive number. So here we prompt user to enter a positive number. After that, let's read the input from the console and assign the value to the variable num. So we'll use scanner next int. And in while section, we will have number is less than or equal to 0. So it means that we will execute this block of code at least once, and we'll proceed executing this block of code while number is less than or equal to 0. So after we finish, let's print thank you. So we finally received a positive number as we expected. So let's run the program and see the output. Okay, so the program prompts us to enter a positive number. Let's enter something negative, -1. Let's enter 0, -10. Okay, it doesn't work as you can see. And now let's print a positive number, 1. Okay, the program has printed thank you and exited. So in this example, we used do-while loop to repeatedly prompt the user for input until they enter a valid number greater than 0. And as you can see, do-while loops can be a useful tool in situations where you want to ensure that the code within the loop is executed at least once before checking the condition. And keep in mind that using a do-while loop will cause the code within the loop to execute at least once, even if the condition is false. Therefore, you should use a do-while loop only when this behavior is desired. So that's all for the segment on the syntax and usage of do-while loops in Java. Now, let's talk about the break statement. The break statement is used to exit a loop early before the loop's condition is met. For example, let's say we have a loop that counts from 1 to 10 and prints the counter to the console. But we want to exit the loop as soon as we reach a certain number, let's say 5. So we can use the break statement to accomplish this. Let's do that. So we have a loop, and within the body, if I equals 5, then we'll just break. It means that we will exit the loop entirely if I is equal to 5. So in this example, the loop will start at 1 and increment until it reaches 5. And once it reaches 5, the if statement's condition is met and the break statement is executed, causing the loop to exit. The output of this code will be 1, 2, 3, and 4. So let's run and make sure that the output is 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, we can see it. Now, let's talk about the continuous statement. The continuous statement is used to skip the current iteration of a loop and continue with the next one. This can be useful in situations where a certain condition is met and we don't want to execute the rest of the code within the loop for that iteration. One more example. Let's say we have a loop that counts from 1 to 10 and we want to skip all even numbers. So we can use the continuous statement to accomplish this. So let's do that. Here we need to check if the number is even in order to skip it. So let's do it. If I %sign 2 is equal to 0, it means that if the remainder of the operation when I is divided by 2 is equal to 0, it means that if we divide I by 2 and the remainder of this operation is 0, then we'll skip this iteration. Let's write continue. So in this example, the loop will start at 1 and increment until it reaches 10. For each iteration, the if statement checks if the current number is even by using of the modulus operator or the %sign. If it's even, the continuous statement is executed, and the current iteration will be skipped in this case. The output of this code will be 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9. So let's run the program and check the output. Okay, it's 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. That's fine. It's important to note that the break statement will exit the entire loop, while the continuous statement will only skip the current iteration. Also, the break and continuous statement should always be used inside if statements or switch statements. Let's talk about using the right loop for the task at hand. As we discussed earlier, the for loop is best used when you know the number of iterations in advance. The while loop is best used when you want to keep looping as long as a certain condition is true. And the do while loop is best used when you want to execute the loop at least once, but then continue only if a certain condition is true. Choosing the right loop for the task at hand can save you a lot of processing power and make your code run faster. Next, let's talk about using break and continue statements. The break statement is used to exit a loop prematurely, while the continue statement is used to skip an iteration of a loop. Using these statements can also help make your code more efficient, as they allow you to control the flow of the loop and avoid unnecessary iterations. It's also important to be mindful of the conditions inside your loop. When you're using a condition inside the loop, make sure that it's not too complex and that it's not doing unnecessary work. This will also help to make your code run faster. Lastly, it's important to be mindful of the variable you are using inside the loop. It's best to avoid using global variables inside the loop as they can cause unexpected behavior. Instead, use local variables inside the loop, which will make your code more efficient and less prone to errors. These are just a few tips to keep in mind when working with loops in Java. By following these best practices, you can ensure that your code is efficient and runs smoothly. Remember to always test your code and profile it to identify any errors that could be improved. So that's it for this lesson on loops. We've covered a lot of ground in this lesson, from the basics of the loops to more advanced techniques for efficient looping. And I hope you found this lesson helpful and that you're now more confident in your ability to work with loops in Java. Thank you for attention and see you on the next lesson. Bye.